Do 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 do. Extras. The planar energy elementals that had escaped from the labs in Ginneron, the dog-like tentacled Fel-things, and the fairy dragon-looking Fey-things, didn't come from any book. They were both firmly in the realm of monster created by the GM. They were meant to add pressure and intensity to the party's attempt to escape from the depths of the underground facility, filling the role of the zombies from Resident Evil, as well as the random encounter every 5 feet from a JRPG dungeon. In fact, I really wanted to do an homage to Final Fantasy games in showing the fights against them, but time constraints got in the way. I would have had to practice 8-bit sprites for the PCs, and figure out the best way to simulate it in vector art, which is the medium I use for all the images of TDDC. In any case, the idea was that the dog-like Fel elementals, with their backlash damage, would be fairly obnoxious, but Angel's reach and the negative energy resistance on Black's new super armor would allow them to avoid the backlash, and Little One's magical cold iron sword would allow him to deal with the fairy dragon-looking Fey elementals, since they had a special rule that the same thing which penetrates their DR also penetrates their incorporealness, which would otherwise be a 50% mischance. There were several problems with this plan. For one, the PCs had a harder time than expected penetrating the Fel Dog's damage reduction 5/good. Although these lacked the immunity to critical hits of classical elementals, Angel had only a +1 small-sized spike chain with no strength bonus, so she needed to roll a 5 or better on her d6 damage die in order for any damage to penetrate, otherwise she'd deal no sneak attack at all. So although Little One's cold iron sword seemed like the perfect weapon to deal with the Fey things, they needed him using his special moves on the Fel dogs, leaving the others hacking away with improvised weapons made of cold iron. Their damage was low, but at least it worked on the otherwise incorporeal fairy dragons, taking them out in 2 or 3 hits, depending on the strength of the wielder. When I created Ginneron, I had inspirations from different places. I've mentioned the dungeon's flow from the first Resident Evil movie. Having an evil computer was also fun. I've mentioned the JRPG-style pseudo-random encounters, but there was one NPC who had another very specific inspiration. The Ancient Knight from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Oh sure, that was epic and clean, whereas GE7's sacrifice was a little overcomplicated and contrived, but I felt it would have achieved a similar emotional tone. The ancient Warforged passing on his armor, then waving farewell from the Force Sphere, compared to the salute from the Grail Knight standing behind the Great Seal. Despite trying to design the evil controller fight so that the heroes could stop it before it could disable the portal's manual override, for some reason I'd never properly planned for GE7 to survive, so when Draven decided to sacrifice 7, I was left scrambling to fully detail the Warforged cleric's stats and work out what he should be doing in the dungeon and in the world after his scheduled expiry date. The way the portal functions is pretty weird, and clearly written to force a certain situation. For one thing, based on what happens, its functioning seems to be more dependent on the shape of the portal than the actual structure, since cracking one of the standing stones all the way through does not destroy it until the stones are actually allowed to fall down. There's also a serious question of whether they should or should not have destroyed the portal before sealing it in, though GE7 did not really present them with a choice. He was just like, "This is what we must do." His theory is that destroying the portal would create a burst of astral energy, which is bad, but if left running in its broken state, the long-term results in terms of contaminating the area and saturating the surrounding communities would be much less from this single burst than it would be if the portal was allowed to pump out energy continuously for years. In fact, the out-of-control tear in the dimensional fabric might have even increased its energy output over time. For pacing and flow of the video, I skipped over Tirim's death scene in the episode, which also made sense because any viewer who hasn't watched the extras with some of Tirim and Greypike's conversations about the gods would miss out some of the context. So, even as the party discovered DeCorso's missing steward and his slain friend, this other tragedy was unfolding in the halls behind them. The young dwarf priest was slain by a Fel-thing, having long since run out of healing magic. As he lay dying, he managed to open his eyes and found himself gazing up at GE7, the priest of Itaru. Tirim clutched his own holy symbol, the symbol of Moradin, patron god of dwarves, so distressingly similar to that of the Itaran deity, and a final question escaped him like a sigh, as if he knew the answer was not what he wanted to hear, but was compelled to ask anyway.
Which is he really, Moradin or Itaru?
He is a god. He is great enough to be both. Moradin awaits you, young priest. And Tirim's face relaxes, looking relieved as he passes away. So at the end, when they're running on fumes, they have to find the strength to break through one last double-sized group of tentacle dogs and mind-stabbingly ghostly Fey. And when they're surrounded on all sides, the large, messed-up hybrid boss appears and starts thrashing them with long-reaching tentacles of his own. It had 2 attacks with a reach of 10 feet, attacking the party tanks over top of a pair of Fel-things, but it also had 2 longer, weaker tentacles with reach 20, which put some pressure on the squishier PCs and NPCs who were also being attacked by Fey dragon things from either side. It was a rough fight, and exciting in its own way, with all the heroes doing everything they can, and the massive pack of NPCs struggling to fight back with cold iron tools salvaged from the Fey lab as improvised weapons. But the fight did sort of drag on, devolving into a pure slogging match to some degree. You hit them, they hit you. Again, resource management and the effort to heal various dwarves back onto their feet using potions or GE7's last spells all added interest, but during the fight, I forgot a special ability I had given the boss. As a full round action, it could turn incorporeal, lasting until the beginning of his next turn, and move its full movement, forcing a will save on anyone it passed through. Those who failed to save would take some damage and become shaken for a minute. Now, this shaken status could not stack with itself, otherwise the fear stacking rules would mean it could panic the whole bunch just by, passing back and forth a few times. But it had the ability to intimidate as a move action as well, which would stack with the other shaken, though even as a move action, it would reduce the boss from 4 attacks a round to just 1. In fact, the whole special thing move would have simultaneously made the fight more interesting and dynamic, and probably made it slightly easier, more manageable, given how much damage this guy was outputting just with his regular melee attacks. But they somehow managed to win, and had just enough people still standing to drag the unconscious ones out to safety, with minutes to spare before the portal collapse-plosion. I should trademark the word collapse-plosion. Sounds more internet-y than implosion.